Hi there, and thank you for tuning in to You and Your Money. I'm your host, Bryan, and tonight's program we are once again focusing on estate planning, which offers insights and guidance to help you make informed decisions. Despite many rumours regarding changes to estate duty over the last few years, which resulted in the introduction of Section 7C and an increase in estate duty from 20 to 25% to those who have assets in excess of 30 million, SARS is now attempting to close the net to avoid losing revenue and have introduced a new requirement relating to trusts. Unfortunately, there's a glitch with our two cameras in the studio, so Harry Joffe, Head of Legal Services at Discovery Life, and Dr. Mervyn Messias, Trust Specialist, will be joining me in the Zoom room. Harry and Mervyn, good evening, and thanks for joining me.
Good evening.
All right, good evening.
Good to have you. Harry, I'm going to put my first question to you is, what is the situation that is now being insisted on by SARS relating to trusts? And you know, I see so many people who consult with me who form trusts but don't have any assets in the trust. What is the position?
Yeah, Brian, I mean, it's actually quite unfortunate now because trusts all have to submit a tax return. That's been the position for a while now. SARS issued a guidance note a while ago that every trust, irrespective of what assets are in the trust, have to submit a tax return. There's another issue now that the trustees of the trust are responsible for the tax issues in that trust. So if there's any tax not paid by that trust as it should be, the trustees are responsible for that and for ensuring the tax returns get submitted. And of course, all the ultimate beneficial owners, which have to be made clear to SARS and to the master as well. So there's a lot of obligations now on trustees when it comes to managing these trusts. I mean, we have seen a lot of trusts where the trust only owns an endowment policy, for example, where of course the trust wouldn't have to pay any tax because the tax is inside the policy. And even those trusts have to do a tax return. So, you know, this concept of a dormant trust doesn't really apply anymore because trusts have to do tax returns. That's not even a debate now. The only issue, of course, is, you know, what to submit on the return and et cetera, et cetera. And Brian, you're finding it now becoming quite costly to run a trust. You know, I was looking at a trust recently, as I say, which just had an endowment policy, had one minor beneficiary, and that trust still has to do a tax return. It still has to report to the master all the beneficial owners of the trust, still has to do everything in terms of, as you said, the tax returns to SARS. And those become costly because you're going to need an auditor, you're going to need to do financial statements. SARS wants to see a copy of all resolutions taken now when you do your returns, because, you know, if you're making distributions out of the trust to beneficiaries to ensure the beneficiaries pay the lower tax rate than the trust, SARS wants to see these resolutions dated and signed correctly. So there's now a lot of compliance around the trust. And of course, we'll come to it later in the show. You now need to think quite carefully whether your trust is still worthwhile. I mean, you always should have thought, what's the point in setting up a trust? But now you need to think even more carefully, given the cost, given the compliance, given the tax issues, is this trust still relevant to your estate planning?
Yeah. Mervyn, thanks for joining us. And Mervyn, in your two books that I've written, you comment regularly about the responsibility of trustees and the fact that just to have a dormant trust or be a trustee as a favour to a friend or family member is really, in your opinion, absolutely taboo.
Well, you should not be a trustee of a dormant trust. Well, you could be you can have a dormant trust that's not doing anything, in the sense that a dormant trust could be a beneficiary in a will. And it's quite a good idea to plan an estate that way, because you don't incur taxes in transferring assets to the trust. You might utilize that trust as a generation skipping device. In other words, you, instead of leaving the assets to a minor child, for example, you leave it to a trust to inherit for the benefit of the child. And then it becomes alive, it becomes pregnant with assets for the child, instead of the child being a minor receiving the assets, or even a major receiving the assets. And it gets filled with assets on death of a party. So it's a good idea to form even a dormant trust for that purpose. the trustees only start their process of acting beneficially for the benefit of the beneficiaries once the assets devolve into that trust on the death of the testator, if you like.
Harry, we've always spoken for many years about the two types of trust, the testamentary trust and the inter vivos trust. In terms of Mervyn's suggestion not to have a testamentary trust, but rather create what we've spoken about with Gordon on many, many occasions, a bottom drawer trust. How do you feel about this? Maybe switch, Harry, from this testamentary trust to a bottom drawer trust?
Bryan, yes, so just a couple of points. Obviously, the bottom drawer trust concept is much more an overseas concept where, because of the high costs of establishing these trusts, you create the trust and you just leave it in the background and you pay much less fees. I mean, typically offshore trusts run to $7,000 plus, whereas a bottom drawer trust is much cheaper. So offshore, that's that concept, more of a cost issue. In South Africa, I mean, I take Mervyn's point. I think it's a much better idea to have a trust set up. Bryan, we've discussed this often on TV, a testamentary trust causes us endless trouble. Now, the reasons for that is a testamentary trust doesn't have a trust deed as such. The trust deed is the will, and you'll find when many clients set up testamentary trusts in their will, they don't have sufficient detail in the will as how to run that trust and how to set it up. So you'll have a very short will, very short instructions, then the testamentary trust has to be set up. And we have, as I say, endless trouble. We have cases where we're not sure at what age the testamentary trust must wind up for the beneficiaries. We're not sure at what age the testamentary trust pays out to beneficiaries. We're not sure if the beneficiaries are vested or discretionary. So I much prefer a trust set up now where there's a proper trust deed. I know Mervyn will draft a comprehensive 25-page trust deed with all the details in, and we don't have anything that can go wrong. Plus, Bryan, number two, the other issue with the testamentary trust, and we have this quite a lot, let's say there's a life policy with a testamentary trust as a beneficiary. The life assured dies, that life policy can't pay out until the testamentary trust is set up. Now, of course, the executor would have to set up a testamentary trust that can take 2 or 3 months or even longer if there's an issue before the executor gets appointed, as sometimes happens. If we do the idea of almost a dormant trust now, which is already set up, to be the beneficiary of that life policy, of course, it takes away that problem, so then it's much quicker to pay out.
Harry,
I mean, the only downside, Bryan, of course, is that you have to pay the costs now of the dormant trust, but I think that's probably a small price to pay. I think it'd be a better idea if you've got a big life policy or a big estate devolving into that trust. I agree with Mervyn. I think a dormant trust is better than a testamentary. But Bryan, I think let's just be clear, a testamentary trust is better than no trust at all. So Mervyn spoke already about a minor beneficiary. If you've got a minor beneficiary, you obviously can't bequeath assets to the minor beneficiary in terms of administration of the Estates Act. It would have to go to a guardian or to a trust. If you've got a life policy, the problem is with a life policy, you can make a minor trust a beneficiary because that's not restricted in terms of the administration of the Estates Act. So there, I would much rather you have a testamentary trust. If the client can't afford a full dormant trust, at least have a testamentary trust, which is better than nothing. But I agree with Mervyn, a dormant trust would be preferable.
Harry, while benefits are being waited to be transferred to a trust, you spoke a couple of months, are those beneficiaries entitled to interest on the proceeds from a life policy?
Well, no, I mean, it's not our error, Bryan. I mean, the thing is, we pay interest if there's an insurance company error. So let's assume the client lodges a claim, and we lose the claim or we don't pay out correctly to the right person, or some error due to us. Yeah, if we're holding the money back because the master's taken a long time to appoint the executor and the executor has taken time to set up a trust, we aren't under a legal obligation to pay interest. There might be an ex gratia payment of some interest if it drags on for years and years, but if it takes a few months, we wouldn't be under obligation to pay interest.
Mervyn, I think because this is a big change, after many years of us discussing testamentary trusts, the idea, so let's just move through this again. I would like our listeners, particularly those who have minor beneficiaries and who have left testamentary trust, are you suggesting they actually make a change to their will and together with their executor or their lawyers actually set up this trust, and just take it through again slowly what you are suggesting that individuals do where they have created testamentary trusts going forward.
But firstly, I think I agree with what Harry has been saying. But if you read my first book on trusts, trusts for everyone, there are three basic reasons why you would look at a living trust rather than a testamentary trust. And they are, the first one is asset protection, which you don't get from a testamentary trust. Asset protection for the person who wants to create a trust, because you have to die before the testamentary trust comes alive. The testamentary trust is for dead people. And the second reason is succession planning. And the third reason is what I think is the main reason, and that is the disability protection. If you become disabled, the living trust can look after you. And the testamentary trust only comes alive, as I say, when you die. So for those three reasons, you would create a living trust, and then the will tidies up what the Americans call a poop scooper. It tidies up whatever's left and pushes it into the living trust when you pass away. So during your lifetime, you would put in and deal with the taxes as best as you can. Now, there's a deeper meaning to this whole thing. And the deeper meaning is that when you came into this world, you came in with nothing. And when you want to leave this world, you would ideally like to leave with nothing. But having built up assets, how do you do that? You put all these assets into a trust. And when you leave the world, you leave no aggravation for your family. It's all tidied up nicely. If you don't tidy it up nicely, you go to my second book, which is on these deceased estates, and you leave the world with your assets nicely tidied up so that the family can wind up your assets in an orderly way. Now, with the trust, the living trust, that is to say, you don't go through the master's office. It's a shambles there. So in the deceased estate section, articles have been written in the newspaper about that, unfortunately. So with the testamentary trust, in order to get into the trust, you have to go through the process of winding up the estate. With the living trust, it's already in the trust, so there's no process. It's business as usual.
Okay, guys, we have to take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk to you guys about one thing, and that is where someone who's given a power of attorney is unable any longer to understand what they're doing and what the processes are, because the cost of going to curatorship is enormous. But stay tuned, we'll be back shortly.